So I would like to welcome on stage Greg. So Greg has been starting his journey, I would say, working in VFX industry. So he worked on movies like Sucker Punch, Prometheus, and Gravity, who we all know was a VFX firework, and I'm still amazed that people really actually got motion sick in the cinema. And I mean, that speaks how much immersive the movie was. And then joined, or swapped sides, joined the gaming industry, working on AAA games, mainly in the storytelling and narrative departments. And now you jumped ship again and are working in VR on a project called Downward Spiral. Yes. And he told me backstage already that he today wants to give us a little cheat sheet that should help us to navigate VR storytelling, and not just VR storytelling, but really making VR sticky, keeping your users engaged, keeping them in there, talking about game mechanics, game structure, all those things. So again, I think we're going to dive a little deeper than just this buzzword VR storytelling and fill it with actual life. So I'm excited for that. Give it up for Greg, and let's start.
Okay, but yeah. Firstly, thanks to VR Now for having me. I'm really happy to be in Berlin. And as discussed, basically this talk is about how to hook people into your stories. To me, as a storyteller, VR is just a medium. I've been lucky to work in animated features, films, big video games, and now in VR. And to me, it's a different way to tell a story. But what I will offer is basically a series of things I've learned from working on big movies, big games, and also VR Now. Okay, let's see if it works. So, firstly, I work at Third Eye Studios. We're based in Helsinki, and we have some business development in Shanghai. As you can see, we also develop great games, but we also make great tools. So if you're using Unity to do VR, we actually offer a lot of great tools and technology. A bit of a background into the company, we're essentially half ex-Remedy, who worked on Max Payne and Alan Wake and Quantum Break, and the other half are actually Unity developers who worked in Copenhagen. So we have a lot of expertise in tools as well. Okay, but as you probably guessed from the name of the talk, it's about how to escape the downward spiral. So our first project was called Downward Spiral Prologue, and rather than tell you about it, I'll show you it.
Shuttle docking complete. Do you copy? Jesus. Can barely see anything. Damn, it's dark.
So as you can see, you can already play the game. It came out in March this year. And essentially, it's a space action adventure, which you can actually play in co-op online. We also offer multiplayer, so we have 8-player player versus player action that you can go into as well. But we have something else that's very interesting, which I'll go into more detail. But first, as kind of discussed, a brief introduction to who I am. So I started and studied computer science in Sydney. I joined the visual effects industry and worked in Sydney and London. As kind of discussed, and Gravity was the last project. But for me as a storyteller, I wanted to do even more. I felt like Gravity was a limit in terms of visual effects, of what we could be doing and pushing further. So I decided to try interactive storytelling in games, worked on Quantum Break, and now I'm in VR. So these are some of the projects I've gotten to work on, and to me, they all have something that's in common. So I worked on Happy Feet, Gravity, Quantum Break, and now Downward Spiral. To me, whether it's an animated feature, it's a movie, it's a VR experience, it's an AR experience, it's a mixed reality experience, it's any experience, it's always about telling a great story. And to me, that's the biggest hook. It's also about taking the constraints and making them advantages. Across all of my experience in all of these mediums, we always had issues. If we were trying to get a penguin to dance in Happy Feet or trying to get an astronaut to float in gravity, we had to know what the limit was, and once we knew the limit, we could make it into something even better. But as I said, I don't have much time, so I'm going to offer you a bunch of experience I've had and different ideas to kind of consider when you're designing your experiences. Number one, this was kind of discussed by the previous talk, but unlike games, traditionally in games you're told you're Super Mario, you're Master Chief, you're a character. In VR and AR, you're yourself. To me, it's more similar to designing a ride at Disneyland, where it's more anonymous in a sense. If you're designing a VR and AR experience and you're telling them that the player or user is someone they're not, it doesn't work that way. As we just heard, it's the people inside of what you're creating. So the moment that you actually do an experience, you should be designing it more like a ride or more like something that's more open-ended and anonymous. You can try to do it, as we've done in games for a long time, but I don't feel it works. I think you actually need to be more open to the medium. Next thing, we can't talk about VR without motion sickness. Motion sickness is obviously very real. I think there's a lot of content creators who ignore it and they create content which can make people sick. But these are three things that I think are very important. Number one, you can't take the free movement that is used in normal games with controllers and put it in VR. It'll make people sick. So if you want to attract people to your experience, don't do that. Pretty simple. 90 frames per second, that's a very hard technical thing to achieve. If you're not achieving this, you're also going to make people sick. So once again, if you don't want to push people away, you need to actually technically achieve to get the correct frame rate. And finally, it's something that I discovered is sudden stops. So it's traditional that people in cars, they get motion sick, whereas in trains, people generally don't. And to me, my observation was, in a car, you're constantly stopping. You're constantly going back and forward. We also found in Downward Spiral that if a player hits a wall, or if they hit something in between, the movement of going forward and then stopping quickly, instant motion sickness. So another tip, if you want to hook people into your experience, don't make them sick. So if you aren't achieving 90 frames per second, if you're using a free movement set from another medium, or you have a sudden stop, it's probably not going to work. So next up, Locomotion. I kind of had a final, well, I guess in this case, there's three ways. The first way is vehicle-based, so if you're in space, you have a spaceship, or if you're in the world, you have a car. These are ways not to get people sick. Teleportation, I'm sure you're all familiar that you can put yourself in different places in the world. Or you can create your own, and this is what I recommend the most. So I can show you how we did it in Downward Spiral. So as you can see, essentially, we call it grab to move, where you use the motion controller, you pull the trigger, you grab onto something, and you push, and it feels like you're sliding through zero gravity in space. This causes no motion sickness, because essentially, we're not trying to trick the mind with a different controller setup. We're one of the few developers to be doing this. It obviously matches games with certain gravity conditions, but to me, coming into VR, one reason I wasn't as interested was that in most experiences, you can't explore. And to me, that's the most interesting thing in games. It's you can create the set, and in a game, you can explore it. But if you can choose a locomotion that can actually blend with your story and offer narrative design, I think you're creating something even more special. So a few quick technical things that we learned from this. Number one, obviously, grab objects to move should make sense. But we also use curve deacceleration. So as I mentioned, if the player suddenly hits something and they stop, it will cause motion sickness. But if you use almost like a logarithmic curve, that the speed actually slows down, it actually won't. we also slow down the collisions, and we also found, well, the faster you go, the harder you hit. So we kind of slowed that down as well. So if you're looking into this sort of movement mode in your experience, I recommend these things. Invest in tutorials. I think because VR is a new experience, it's something that we know very well in game design, but the importance of having a tutorial that actually trains your audience about how to use your experience. There's a few tips. Always make sure it's in headset. I've played quite a few where you have to take the headset off to read instructions, then you need to put it back on. So you kind of think it's common sense, but it's a really important thing. I think in VR, particularly if your experience is free, it makes it even easier to uninstall and delete. So if you want to keep people in your experience, you need to actually train them and teach them. There's also something known as Nintendo design that we know in game design. The way that Nintendo teaches tutorials is they have 3 phases. They've been doing it since Super Mario. They call it learn, practice, master. So learn, press A to make Mario jump. The player can press A. Practice, a safe situation for the player to actually experience and get to understand the mechanic. And master, there's a place in the game where you cannot proceed until you've mastered the previous thing that was taught. If you look at any game, every game follows this. If they don't, traditionally it's not a very good tutorial and people don't understand how to do it. But if you're doing a tutorial, keep it in headset, learn, practice, master, and also show controller input. So this is how we did it. As you can see, we show the controller. It has the actual button that you can see. So you're learning. Okay. Practice, you need to reach to equip, so you reach into the world to pull the trigger. Master. Learn, practice, master. So that's how we've done it. But it's really important to kind of keep it in headset and allow your audience in any type of experience to actually learn your systems, whether it's locomotion, action, anything. So design for fatigue. I haven't heard this being said at the conference so far, but for me personally and in all of our testing, it takes around 20 minutes for people to want to take a headset off. In general, it can be quite uncomfortable, it can be sweaty around your face, it can be just uncomfortable in general for any extended period of time. So the thing that we've done is we're using an episodic structure. So for our story, we've structured it more like a TV show, where we make sure that our narrative has chunks that kind of go through so the player can choose to stop and have a good point in the story to stop at. Because in general, there's a lot of stories that just continue and go onwards, and there's usually not even a way to pause. So I think if you want to kind of bring your audience into your experience, you also need to kind of design for fatigue. Realize that people won't be able to wear the headset for hours, so why not make it into smaller chunks? That way everyone can. Player guidance. This is another sort of game industry sort of thing, but it's the term in which how a player knows where to go within your experience. So the thing that all good games do is they always design 180 degrees forwards, essentially here. So what it means is that the player can always see where they want to go. And these 3 principles, reveal, visible destination, and smooth camera, they're from Naughty Dog. They're the famous studio that made the game Last of Us and Uncharted and Crash Bandicoot. Every single one of their games follows these principles. And I think in VR, whether you're doing 360, AR, anything, if you follow these principles, more of your users will actually understand what to do, where to go, and proceed through your experience and have a better experience overall. So reveal, when it's 160 degrees forward, you can always see where you're supposed to be going. The visible destination, where am I supposed to go after that? And smooth camera. This is the term that you don't want any like rough camera moves in general in games. So if you have a door that's behind, that's bad because it means the camera has to spin a full amount. Whereas if it's smooth, so it only has to move a certain range of degrees, it's better. Audio. I think this is probably one of the most critical things in VR that I haven't heard many people talk about either, but I think it's even more than visuals. If you can have a great Foley, great atmosphere, everything, it sets the mood and it brings a reality to it all. There's nothing more realistic than in VR than trying to touch something in the world and it doesn't create a sound, or it doesn't fall over, or it doesn't actually have any immersion to it. So once again, if you want to bring people into your experience, you should also be paying for good sound. It's not just the visuals. Everything is fun. This is something else that's very interesting. I think that it's also a very new experiential medium. Have any of you tried or have you seen the Star Trek experience that came out? Essentially, I'm not the biggest Star Trek fan, but what was found was nobody took it seriously. So in VR, everyone's waving their hands, jumping around, going crazy. And I think this is because it's a new medium. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that you should let your audience interact with your world. And an easy way to do this is to use systems. This is something that we didn't plan, and this is what happened in our game. We had physics, we have co-op, people play fetch. It's incredibly simple, but we could have not allowed this in the game. But the fact we did just makes our world so much more realistic and interesting. So I think if you're looking for a way to kind of get people to be more immersed in your world, you should just provide different sort of interactions. We didn't intend this, but the game is so much better, and the immersion is so much stronger. And that's just another person playing online that you're experiencing the world with. So I think it's a very fun medium, but I think it also has challenges. I think you need to be really aware of harassment, unfortunately. I feel that in VR, particularly in multiplayer experiences with avatars, you need to look into block and muting. You need to have, what we do at Third Eye Studios is we actually fade out other players. Because in VR, when you have someone floating towards you, it can be quite intimidating. And I think it's kind of a new ethical thing that we need to think about with this medium, that there are things that we need to be designing for. So we've kind of chosen these features, but I think the moment that you have interactions feeling real and worlds that feel as real, we run into this problem. So it's something that we're trying to solve. We don't have all the solutions, but I think it is another thing that if you want to hook players, if you want to get them into your world, don't push them away through harassment. You need to kind of ensure that you have good systems and good protocols to make sure everyone feels included. And this kind of shifts towards more general thoughts. So being a game developer and filmmaker, I think one of the strongest things you can do to tell a story is not your screenplay, it's your world. In this term, it's known as production design. So I have two pictures, and I think production design can be in nightclubs like in Berlin, or in games like Quantum Break, where you're designing the experience and the world to actually tell a story and give meaning. If you aren't doing this, you're missing a huge opportunity. One thing I learned in games is nothing is by chance. Every detail that we put into Quantum Break or any game has to be placed, has to be rotated, has to be scaled, has to be built. Nothing comes for free. So if you want to create a great experience that brings people in, tell a story with your environment as well. The next thing is known as narrative design. Narrative design to me is where you blend your systems with your mechanics. So if you're telling a story, or I think a better way of putting it, there's been a lot of criticism of games today where the story and the mechanics don't make sense. So there's an action game where you play a friendly, happy guy, and the actions he causes destruction and killing and all this horrible stuff. So to me, if you want to create a better story and a better experience, you should not do this. You should realize that the world you're creating is a horrible place, and I think The Last of Us on the left is a great example. It's kind of known currently as being one of the best games. It follows a brutal world with a brutal character who's trying to save Ellie, who's on the right. And I think that the narrative design in this experience is what's made this being such a great experience, because there isn't this question that kind of is baffling people, like most games. I also have Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic, an older game, but it was really revolutionary in that it took a rule set from another game and it applied it to Star Wars and it made sense. So I think that if you want to create a great world that kind of brings people in, do narrative design as well. Don't allow interactions that go against the storytelling. Make the storytelling the actions. Aim for activity, not passiveness. So everyone knows in film, it's show, don't tell. That's simple. In games, it's play, don't show. What I mean by that is, it isn't a passive medium. For every experience in your VR experience, AR, anything where you can allow your audience to participate, it's better. And that's what all game developers are striving for. On the left, that's Uncharted 2, which is famous for its active cinematic experience, which literally makes it feel like you're in a blockbuster. The strongest thing in this scene is that you're not watching it. On the right is Half-Life 2, which is kind of deemed to be one of the best games. no cinematics, 0. You can constantly move, you can constantly explore. So I think now we're into this new medium of VR. This is a great game technique that you can take as well. Play, don't show. Steal. This is quite a strange thing, but I think it's a great quote as well. I think Picasso kind of hit it on the head with this, but if you want to kind of bring the audience into your world, you need to listen. You need to see what other people are doing, but don't just copy what they're doing. You want to see what they're doing and take it to an even further place. You want to take it further, faster, and crazier. So you need to know what's happening, but you also need to push it. Picasso didn't kind of come from a vacuum. He came from a world of art, and he kind of took different elements and pushed it further. He stole. This is one of my favorite artists, Monet. To me, even though this is like incredibly calm painting, it's also revolutionary. It's also punk. Because what he did when everyone else was painting the same way, he chose to paint a different way with the Impressionists. So the next point for me is, well, how do I make people come to my experience? VR, AR, game, movie. Innovate. Do something new. It's pretty easy to tell if your idea isn't new, and if it isn't, then maybe it should be. And I think if you do that, you'll be rewarded. And the ultimate hook, what's the biggest hook of all? A great story. So you're probably thinking, that's great, thanks for that, but how do I do a great story? Everyone wants to do a great story. And this is something that I've been thinking about, and it's something I do with all of my stories that I write or I work on. To me, a great story is a world, a message, and a question. It's a world for your audience to jump into, a message for them to discover. So whether it's the meaning that you're trying to say or subtext. And finally, a question. What happens next? What does this story do to me? How has it changed how I feel? If you can tell a great story, it has a world, a message, and a question. But yeah, dankeschön. And I hope I have time for questions.
All right. That was a lot. I hope you all wrote it down. There's a really, really lot of good stuff in there, and nicely summarized. So I think you accomplished your goal of creating a nice cheat sheet for VR storytelling and overall VR experience design. Do you guys have any questions that you want to shoot out? Now's the time. No questions? So what is the most horrible mistakes that you've seen people do in VR?
I think the tutorials out of headset is just, it's horrible.
Yeah,
the amount of times that you're like, okay, I put it on, and then you just don't know how to play the thing, and then you kind of have to close, reopen. Oh, when I have the headset on, there's a little, I think that's a big thing.
And what's your favorite VR experience where there's like, you know, like sometimes I know that I find those things where I'm just like, wow, that's like so genius, they solved it like that. So what are those moments for you? Or like a few
I'd recommend 2 VR experiences if you have access. The first one is Valve's Lab, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's like going to Disneyland. It's incredible. And the second one is a game called Lone Echo that came out in the summer. It's spectacular. Like in terms of UX, innovation in VR, everything. Unfortunately, like most VR, I don't think many people know about it or have played it. But since you're here, I'll spread the word. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Lone Echo. Yep, Lone Echo. It's exclusive to Oculus. It's an Oculus exclusive, but it's spectacular. I think in terms of game design and sort of revolutionizing storytelling, it does have some issues. That's where I got the point about fatigue. You play the game and it goes for 4 hours straight and there's no stopping point, so it's...
Yeah, I had to pull myself out of it at some point.
Yeah,
because I was just like, and I took the headset off and I just realized how my eyes are burning and you're like,
yeah,
oh.
Yeah, but a lot of games do this as well.
Yeah, that's true. That's it's hard to stop. But on the other hand, I can see how you want to design for that as like, you know, when you like, you want to keep the people in because every time you take off the headset, there's just a certain friction to come back and do it again. So how do you work with that? If you're splitting it up across different episodes, do you have like a cliffhanger at the end?
Yeah, we always use cliffhangers, and to me, I think we have more to take from novels than movies in VR. Honestly, like having the chapter structure, it's much better. I think doing the full-blown 4-hour action experience, I don't feel it's the way to go. I think do it like a great novelist. Like have a great cliffhanger that makes the reader want to read the next chapter and see what happens. And
So did you publish it all at once, all the episodes, or are they coming out bit by bit?
So the future of the company is the prologue is half an hour. The new game is going to be chaptered.
Okay, cool. Any
I
questions?
think we have
from
one
you?
question.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I think the biggest thing was Foley, where we actually tried to make sure we could apply a sound to different things. And the way we did that, if you're a game developer or developer, we use the materials. So we put a sound on the materials. So if you take a metal object, any metal object, and you tap it against a metal object, it does a metallic sound. It's what we traditionally do in games, but just actually spending the extra time to do that was worth it. And finally, music. Like, you don't know if you noticed, but there's really cool music at the end of the trailer. That's by Ville Valo, who's the composer of Him, which is like a Finnish goth rock band. So he's done this incredible synth soundtrack for it all. So we kind of turn that in just at the right point towards the end to kind of get the end finale.
Yeah,
But
no,
yeah.
I realized that. The music was really good.
Yeah, the music, it's even cooler in the new one, so keep an eye out.
All right, thanks so much, Greg.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care. Thanks, man.